use what I'm good. Just to introduce quickly what I'm going to be talking about today. Today, the focus is going to be on our paper that we wrote together with Stefania Ionescu, who is a PhD student at our social computing group, Aniko Hanak, who is the group leader of the group, and also David Garcia, professor at the Technical University of Graz. And the paper is about the politicization of medical preprints online, effectively, during the early stages of COVID-19 pandemic. And here I added deconstructing the study. That's not part of the paper. However, instead of just presenting the paper today, I thought that it might be kind of beneficial in the context of the summer school to deconstruct different steps of the study and also situate the study within the computational social science field and kind of take little detours while presenting the study itself to like broader context of computational social science and certain data collection aspects or data analysis aspects. So it's not going to be, again, just presenting what we did and what we found, but also what we did and why we decided to do that, and looking at different steps. And thanks for the introduction. I had the first slide essentially repeating what was already said, essentially. So yeah, indeed, currently I'm a postdoc at the University of Zurich, Social Computing Group, Department of Informatics, where I drifted to this informatics, part all the way from Asian studies. I did a BA in Korean studies, actually, which had nothing to do with what I'm doing now. And then I went on to get a master's degree in political science, and that's essentially where I discovered the existence of computational methods. And since then, I basically never went back, and used that extensively in my MA, but also in my PhD later on. And my research interests are broadly in the field of online political, but sometimes also not political communication, algorithmic fairness, and computational methods with their application to social scientific problems. So essentially computational social science. And now what we're going to talk about, as I said, the focus is our paper regarding the politicization of medical preprints, but I'm going to a little bit deconstruct that. And I know that we have an hour and a half. And please feel free, if you come up with some questions during the presentation, to just unmute yourself and ask the questions, or maybe post them in the chat. But like with the chat, I am not going to be seeing those that much while I'm presenting. So probably it's better if you unmute yourself if you want to ask some question immediately. But also I expect that we will have some time for the Q&A afterwards. So background, before we started the study, before there was a research idea, what we knew from also previous research, or at that point, there maybe not so much of the research was out yet, because we started this around last summer. But there were also media reports, which we could kind of draw inspiration from. So essentially, we know by now that people's political attitudes are related to their likelihood to adhere to different COVID-19 related measures, be it social distancing or mask wearing, or be it support for lockdowns, for example. And in the US, for instance, Republicans are less likely than Democrats to perceive social distancing as a helpful measure and to adhere to it actively. And the same applies to mask wearing. Something similar can be observed also in the other countries. So essentially, other countries tend to be less polarized than the US with respect to this, two-party alignment. However, conservatives in general are less likely to perceive social distancing or mask wearing, et cetera, and other measures as helpful. Conservatives are less likely to adhere to those than kind of more progressively oriented, like politically oriented citizens. In addition to just society being polarized around that, online conversations about COVID-19 also tend to be highly polarized. For example, online debates surrounding mask wearing have been found to be polarized, and hashtags about preventative measures are twice as prevalent among Democrat and neutral Twitter users than among Republican ones in the US, again confirming this, like that Democrats are in the US more strongly in support of preventative measures than Republicans. So that is one side of the story, right? That COVID-19 and COVID-19 related measures, though they are largely, they have to do with public health, so they are medical in nature, but they become subject of not just medical or scientific, but also political debates. That's what we see all over the world, basically. At the same time, especially in the early stages of the pandemic, people often relied on scientific evidence to make their judgments or decisions. People often relied not just on peer-reviewed articles, because traditional peer review system tends to be slow, and traditional channels of scientific publishing were a little bit overwhelmed by all the new evidence and new studies coming out on COVID-19. And preprints, so a form of scientific publishing where one can essentially publish a not yet peer-reviewed study. For example, while one study is going under peer review, you can submit a study to a preprint server and it will be published there. And it will have a note that it's not a peer-reviewed scientific study. So during the peer review, something there, like maybe some parts of it will be disconfirmed. Maybe the reviewers will find some errors in the analysis, or maybe they won't find any and it's good as is. But anyway, so preprints are not equal to peer-reviewed scientific studies in terms of how much we can rely on those. So these are like preliminary findings, if you will. But due to the peer review systems being overwhelmed, scientists were publishing a lot more preprints, especially on COVID-19. And what we also know is that people often relied on preprints instead of peer-reviewed studies in the COVID-19 related arguments. And there was an increase in the number of preprints, and again, an increase in the public attention to these preprints. So people started kind of caring more about those, and maybe if they find a preprint that confirms their belief, be it the belief in social distancing is effective or a belief in social distancing is ineffective, in all, like, you know, this ocean of preprints, one could find essentially studies confirming both arguments. People would use those to argue for their opinion online. And in the beginning, so based on all of that, we had research questions. Well, before we had research questions, we had a very broad research idea, but perhaps like the part where we come from a research idea to concrete research questions, this process is probably worth of a separate talk, and this talk is not going to be computational social science specific. So here I just jump directly to the next step and say that, like, okay, in the beginning we had research questions, and we came down to 4 research questions. So the first one, we wanted to check, again, has the level of interest in medical preprints online or specifically on social media increased during the COVID-19 pandemic? And did it level off maybe at some point? Which medical preprints have attracted the most attention? Then, is there evidence of political partisanship in the share patterns of COVID-19 related preprints? And did the discourse about preprints somehow change with the COVID-19? So did people start to refer to them somehow differently than they did before start of the but how do we approach these questions? And now, naturally, all of us, the 4 co-authors of the paper, are situated in the field of computational social science. We naturally approach the questions with computational social science methods and computational social science data and approaches. So if we were working, for example, in classical social science, we would use probably different methods, probably different data sources. So probably we would go in to answer at least like maybe first two questions. The first question, we would ask people about it. We would maybe fill the survey, probably like try to get a national representative survey in some country, something like that. Same with maybe the fourth question would be answered differently. We would employ qualitative methods, qualitative discourse analysis, etc. But that's not what we did, because again, that's not the field that we are working in. The field that we are working in is computational social science. But what is it? And before I move on to the next slide, I would like to ask the audience, yeah, I forgot to mention it. I like to approach audience with the questions, because I think it makes stuff a little bit more interactive. Please don't be shy in, and don't be afraid to give a wrong answer or not a wrong answer, because essentially a lot of questions I'm asking don't have just one answer. So it is like, you know, nobody's gonna judge you for answering one way or another. So what is the computational social science field? How is it different, let's say, from social science? You can also type in the chat, for example. The chat, here's the chat. I will wait a couple of seconds. I will wait a moment. Maybe somebody decides to type in or unmute themselves, or
don't be shy, guys. Come on.
I mean, if not, I will move on after some time, but maybe it would be good. Okay, I will probably move on at this point. Oh, okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you. I see an answer in the chat. So computational social science researchers use process-generated data exclusively in addition to classical data. Yeah, so what do you mean here by process-generated data? I think I understand what you mean, but let's... So classical data here, I assume we would mean maybe surveys, right? Or diaries that we ask people to fill out. When it comes to social sciences, again, of course, in other fields, there are a ton of other data sources, or maybe classic like texts, leveraging algorithms, AI, and quantitative tools to extract information from data regarding society, answer society related questions. This generated data word did not define the collection process a priori. Heavy emphasis on computational methods. Similar RQs to classical social scientists, but computational methods. Thanks a lot. So you're right. So the person, Said, focused on data source, right? And other people, Francesco, Esther, and Stefan, focused more on methods, and to RQs being from social science, but the methods being from somewhere else. Right, I will do, sorry, trying to put the chat in place here. Yeah. So computational social science is essentially development and application of computational methods to complex, typically large scale, human or sometimes simulated behavior data. And here I also put an asterisk. Alternatively, is social computing. I think that computational social science is currently the more widely spread term, but also we, for example, are called social computing group. And I also heard social computing being used as a synonym essentially for computational social science more than one time. My impression is that computational social science is grounded in social sciences and refers to exactly what Stephanie described in the chat, usage of computational methods to study social phenomena. Social computing is more grounded in the computer science and refers to the development and application of also of methods to study phenomena, but social computing is maybe more coming kind of from the roots of computer science and more often used by computer scientists, it seems to me, and computational social science by social sciences, but the social scientists, but they refer to like essentially the same field. And this ambiguity of terms has to do with the fact that computational social science is an emerging field largely, or maybe, okay, it has already emerged, but definitely not yet matured. So it is a very young field compared to other domains of social science, more classical disciplines in social science. This field is probably like a dozen years old. And why and how it developed? Again, as Stephanie said, social science brought applications and questions, and computer science brought methods, and this mix produced computational social science. And then as something referring to what Said mentioned in the chat, it's different. So around the end of, let's say, 90s, beginning of 2000s or late 2000s, there were two concurrent developments. On the one hand, new data. So the advent of the internet and other digital technologies has led to an explosion in the amount of data about human behavior, the types of data that did not exist before, were not accessible before. And there were developments in the methodological part. So developments in the field of computing, great methods allow analyzing extremely large volumes of data at a very fast pace. So 50 years ago, the amount of data one can analyze just using your laptop, or maybe if you manage somehow use your phone for that, or like processing power, I mean, of your phone, is like, you know, big rooms with where computers were standing, and one computer would take up a whole room and still would be much less powerful than your laptop. Together, these developments led to kind of, or set background for the emergence of computational social science. First, the questions that we are currently asking as computational social scientists were asked by owners, or like by tech businesses. But by now they are actively asked in the academic domain. So what I mean asked by tech businesses, for example, with the advent of the internet, people needed to somehow earn money on the internet, right? And a lot of stuff was free at first, but then many started, for example, selling ads and targeting ads. And to target them effectively, you had to know something about your audience. So you had to gather some insights about who are your customers, who is your audience, who are your users. And for that, you had to ask some of the questions that are now asked by computational social scientists. For example, when we're looking at some emerging phenomena online, let's say there is some online campaign, some hashtag based, let's say, activism happening online on social media, and we want to know who are the people behind it. So who are the people who are engaging in this, and who are the people who do not engage in a certain political topic online. For that, we need to know more about these people, and we need to learn more about them based on their online activity. All questions were asking for profit purposes, and academics are now asking for very different, with a different, but questions are similar. And as I said, that's a young field that developed mostly in the last decade. As late as 2009, David Lazar and his colleagues in their paper in Nature described the field as new and emerging, and still more like, but nonetheless. And if you go to, for example, and you visit a computational social science conference, and then go to a traditional social science conference, one thing you can notice is the difference in the crowd. So computational social science conferences are, I think, I haven't any studies on that, but I think that just from the visual perspective, participants are always like the median age of the participants is much lower than in social science conferences of disciplines, and that also has to do with the field just coming of age. However, when we say that it's new, we should not forget that academics strive to leverage computer science advances to study social phenomena back in the days as well, even if they didn't have enough processing power and all of these new data sources. So, for example, as early as the 50s, there was what I would call a prototype of computational social science, as described in a book by Jill Lepore, If Then, where she describes how, let's say, proto-computational social science was in the 50s leveraged in the field of American politics, where academics were trying to help politicians to get elected based on this computational analysis of citizens' data. This was later forgotten, and the field, and then academics came back to the same questions and to the same mix of social scientific questions and computational methods only later. And again, the field is emerging and maturing now. So jumping back to the study with this little detour into the generalities of computational social science, what is the most common data type used in CSS? Well, Said started saying that there is what he called their process-generated data. But like the commonly used term, which I think denotes something very similar to what Said described, is digital trace data. That's the most common type of data in computational social science, and that's also what we used. And here I'm listing a quote from Duncan Watts. I think it's a great quote describing what digital trace data done to the field. So he wrote, just as the invention of the telescope revolutionized the study of the heavens, so too, by rendering the unmeasurable measurable, the technological revolution in mobile, web, and internet communications has the potential to revolutionize our understandings of ourselves and how we interact. 300 years after Alexander Pope argued that the proper study of mankind should lie not in the heavens, but in ourselves, we have finally found our telescope. Let the revolution begin. So to this, to our telescope here, he refers to digital trace data, essentially, which really started the revolution in different aspects of social science. The accessibility of the data started the revolution. What is digital trace data? Some examples. So that's the data we find online on different online platforms, social media data, web blogs and forums, online shops, whatnot, web search data. Then information we find in audio visual materials we find on different platforms. In addition, with the advent of wearables or smartphones, that is also smartphone log data or wearable data, like wearable log data from your smartwatch or from something else, the data from your smart home, so on and so forth. So why is it called digital trace data? All of us, as we go by and interact with different devices, we leave behind traces. So every day, once you log into Google to search for something, to maybe find a definition of computational social science or whatnot, or maybe look up which piece of code will help you to achieve whichever goal you're currently trying to achieve in your coding, you leave a trace behind yourself. And a lot of these traces are only accessible to the platforms. For example, only you and Google can see what you searched on your Google account, like your search history, unless you decide to download your search history and share it with the researchers later on, of course. But a lot of this data is also public, most notably, probably, social media data. So unless you set your privacy settings, let's say on Facebook or Twitter, to certain parameters, all your posts there will be public, and chances are will be used for research. There are characteristics, and here the characterization of the same applies, like in my opinion. A lot of other digital trace data. So there are characteristics that are positive and conducive, characteristics that are negative for research. Positive include that always on. So essentially, you can always get Twitter data. You can collect it at a certain time. If you compare what so they can only in the archives, let's say from 9 to 5. Computational social digital data. The case, it's just it's non. What we mean by that is that a lot of tweet so this effect people changing. So all pollsters were saying that the majority of like is post hoc. People started saying that, oh no, but there are those voters who just won't tell the truth to the pollsters because they are kind of ashamed of admitting they are voting for Trump or something. So that's not the case with social media or other digital trace data, because people generally don't know that it can be used for research or that it will be used for research. And sometimes this data is big, but there are also a lot of factors that are generally negative for research. For example, it's incomplete. Like it's quite impossible to gather all the digital traces of a single person, at least without asking them for it. And even with asking them for it, probably people do not even remember what they did or what they browsed. So you will never get the complete picture. And also with most digital traces, you get just, you have to sample the data and you get an incomplete sample. It might be very big, but it's still like not always complete. Sometimes this data is inaccessible. If you think social media, for example, getting to Facebook data is almost impossible right now. It's non-representative in the sense that if you're, let's say, again, scraping a social media platform, data from social media platform, you're getting the representation of users of that platform, but not everyone definitely uses Twitter. So you're getting the chunk of the population that are Twitter users. And even if you would have, let's say, all the posts with a certain hashtag, you can't say that it's representative because it's not representative of a given society. It's representative only of Twitter users, and we should keep that in mind. It's algorithmically confounded. So for example, whether people post about something or not can be driven, or repost something, let's say, can be driven by whether they saw it or not, their feed due to the algorithmic filtering. This data is also dirty and sensitive and drifting. So it can change rather fast, and also you can find a lot of sensitive attributes in that data, which would not be good to use for research, and which you should be really careful about how you use it. And if you publish your data, for example, and release it open access, you should also be careful with what you release and whether people can be, for example, identified individual people from what you released, and so on and so forth. But despite, again, all this negative aspects, digital trace data has revolutionized how we study societies and has revolutionized social science. And I have seen like that you had, for example, a lecture on using APIs a couple of days ago, if I'm correct, because I checked the outline of the summer school. I'm sure that depending on your background, you have used some of these data sources or know how to use them. Just wanted to quickly again go through the commonly used sources of like where you can get digital trace data for your, for example, projects. So one is data dumps, data sets released by online platforms, companies, other researchers. Like, for example, there is Twitter. Twitter is releasing collections of data related to misinformation on the platform, or there are a lot of dumps of the data from previous studies on repositories such as Harvard Dataverse or Figshare. Then there are APIs, which again, you already had a lecture on the programmatic points of access of different platforms. Then there is web scraping. A platform does not necessarily have an API, and then you might have to scrape web data yourself. Again, I'm not sure about the backgrounds of people, but I'm attaching some links here. I will share the slides after words where you can find some practical code and practical examples in case you're interested in a specific type and you have had no experience with it before. Then there are data donations thanks to GDPR. GDPR is that law that was passed in the European Union, General Data Protection Regulation. Online platforms are now required to keep and release, one's data. So, for example, under the GDPR, you can, if you are a resident in European Union or a country that also adheres to the same rules like Switzerland, you can file a request, let's say, to Google and say, I want to download all the data you have on me, like maybe all my Gmail, or maybe all my past searches, or maybe all of my YouTube or Google Maps history. And researchers can in turn ask people to get such data and donate it to them for research. So that's what we refer to the data donations and the intentional collection, which would be different to digital trace data. That's what we refer to digital tracking data sometimes. So you can explicitly ask people to install some tool that would collect specific data. For example, install an app on their smartphone that would track their smartphone usage, and people would give consent to that, and they would know that they are being tracked. But sometimes using this, you can get access to the data that is otherwise inaccessible, such as, again, individual smartphone use. To get access to it, you have to explicitly track certain aspects and ask people to share that data with you. So now, thinking of all of this and going back to, our research questions, just a recap, because that was quite a detour. Which data do you think would be right for these questions? Which of the data types? I mean, I already mentioned it a couple of times before, so we'll just move on. Here we chose to use social media data, essentially. Why? Well, because we were curious about the public's attention to specific topics, and probably social media out of all the universe of digital trace data is the most useful and accessible to infer that. So, and we also use Twitter data. Why did we use Twitter data? Well, largely, okay, on one side, because Twitter remains an important online discussion place. And though it's less popular in general than many other social media platforms, it is widely used among different opinion leaders, be it journalists, academics, or policymakers. So stuff that happens on Twitter kind of reflects the certain societal debates, especially those that refer to, let's say, policy making, at least in some countries. So Twitter discussions can have a potential influence in policymaking, which was very relevant in the context of our topic. And also another reason why we, but also other researchers, often use Twitter data is that Twitter data is easily accessible for research purposes. So recently they launched this Twitter Academic API 2.0, which allows people to search the whole Twitter archive if you're doing it for academic purposes. And I'm advertising here an R package for that in case you write in R. If you write in Python, I'm not sure if the libraries already exist, because this Twitter Academic API 2.0 was released just in spring. And I know that when the R package was released, no Python one existed yet, but probably it's all there. Anyway, it's easily accessible, and that leads to sometimes overuse of Twitter data. So Twitter can be useful for our purposes, but it's not the only answer, and it's not the only social media platform. And there is something what I here call the social media usage or study gap. So we opted for Twitter. We could also use some other social media platforms, and very often we as researchers are tempted to use Twitter just because it's there and just because it's so easy to access. But sometimes it's not the right platform to use. And the results of this Twitter being easily accessible, essentially it's probably the social media platform that's the easiest for researchers to access. Unlike Facebook or Instagram, which are very much gated, where you can barely get any data from, Twitter is very open towards academic community and very openly share the data with us as researchers, which again leads to a huge imbalance in the data usage. So here I present an example of that. On the left, you can see the world's most used social media platforms by the number of users in millions here. As of July 2021, so that's the latest release of Hootsuite. And here you can see that Twitter has around 397 million users, making it less popular, well, much less popular than Facebook, but also less popular than Reddit or Pinterest or Snapchat or Telegram or TikTok or Facebook Messenger or Instagram for that matter. So Twitter is by no means the most widely used social media platform. However, it has been and it continues to be the most studied social media platform. I haven't found the data from like more general field, but I found the data with the focus on hate speech and racism from a recent paper by Matamoros Fernandez and Johan Farkas. They conducted a literature review and they checked the share of studies on hate speech and racism on different social media platforms, how many of the different studies examined different social media platforms. And as you can see, like over 50% of studies examined Twitter, then there was Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, etc. Like I think only one study in their sample even looked on, like two studies maybe looked at on Instagram. So as you can see, Twitter is the most studied platform, even though it is by far not the most popular platform. That's what I refer to, the social media usage and study gap. Like, yeah, a bit of warning, even though we studied Twitter here, we could study also something else. It was probably still useful for our purposes, but sometimes Twitter is definitely not the right platform to study, even if the data is super accessible. So that's just something to keep in mind for the future. And again, what data exactly did we collect from Twitter? We were interested in medical preprints, so we collected the tweets that linked to medRxiv. That is the preprint server that is explicitly focused on medical studies. So there are many different preprint servers, but medRxiv that was launched in June 2019 was launched specifically for medical papers. And the data that we collected includes all messages, like all tweets that contained a link to medRxiv and was posted between June 2019. So the time when medRxiv was launched, here it was very easy to figure out the timing, how long back we should sample, just because, well, it made no sense to look for the links before June 2019 anyway, because medRxiv didn't even exist back then. And then the end of June 2020, this has to do with also in part, this way we get two roughly equal periods, one pre-COVID half a year and one post-COVID half a year. But also we were conducting the study like around a year ago, last summer. So that's the data that we had also access to. And that's why in the title we call it the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, because the pandemic isn't over, but we focused here on the first half a year. And now we come to the analysis. So once we got the data, we needed to answer our RQs, but how? Obviously using computational methods. But which ones? And some questions were very easy and straightforward to tackle. Others were not so much. So our first RQ and answering it was rather straightforward. Just to remind you, we wanted to know whether the level of interest in medical preprints online, or in this case on Twitter, increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. To do that, what we had to do is just count the frequency with which people on Twitter put medRxiv links and shared them at different points in time. And here you can see the graph, the resulting graph. So the y-axis is the number of medRxiv preprint shares on Twitter. And at the bottom, we have the x-axis with the date. And as you can see that pretty much until the beginning of COVID on Twitter, barely anyone shared preprints. I will return to it later, but we observed that mostly, like just also by looking at those very few tweets that were shared before COVID, these were mostly tweets like, oh, I just published a new study, or, oh, our lab just published a new study, and maybe sometimes one or two people who would not self-promote their preprints on Twitter. And it would be like, oh, I just saw this very interesting preprint, but that would be, again, a person probably from the scientific or medical community sharing that. And with the advent of the pandemic, all of it changes and people start sharing more and more and more tweets with links to medRxiv and discussing them way more actively on Twitter. Peaked around April, and after that it went down again. And since then, like also at later stages, it did not reach this peak again. But it remains even later on, the part that we didn't cover here, more popular kind of than before the pandemic. But the second question, I messed up the order of appearance here, apparently. So the second question we had, which medical preprints have attracted the most attention? Because it could be that even though this increase in attention coincided with the beginning of COVID, that the preprints people were posting about were not about COVID at all. And that's not the case. So here are the top 10 preprints by the number of tweets linking to them. The titles of these preprints, they all have to do with COVID. That's one thing. Another thing that one can notice here, probably, if you look at it like a little bit closer, is that they deal with of them deal with the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. And I don't know if you followed the news like around a year ago, or if you still remember, because I think the amount of news on COVID has been overwhelming in the past year. But back in the last spring, Donald Trump and other conservative commentators in the US, and also I think Bolsonaro in Brazil, and a couple of other people without medical degrees, but with a lot of followers online, were promoting hydroxychloroquine as one of the effective treatments for COVID-19, and including like this preprints that people used. Like we saw some Fox News journalists in the US, for example, linking to this preprints, to some of the most popular ones, to kind of promote hydroxychloroquine as the use of a treatment for COVID. Later on, the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine was disconfirmed. So even though there were a couple of non-peer-reviewed papers confirming that it's effective, later on their findings were disproven, and there was still no confirmation that it's in any way beneficial, despite the big chunk of at least English-speaking Twitter, conservative Twitter, rated by Trump, being supportive of that and saying that, okay, hydroxychloroquine is now going to save everything. Then there are a couple of studies like this top one, the COVID-19 antibody seroprevalence in Santa Clara County, California. That was a study by John Ioannidis and colleagues, and it was like kind of largely verified. And actually, the case of this preprint was something that first gave us the idea of this whole paper that I'm presenting today. So there was this preprint that showed that based on the antibody seroprevalence in a certain county in California, COVID-19 is much more widespread than previously thought. And that would mean that COVID-19 is much less deadly than less thought. That, like, according to them, it was like less deadly than a flu, probably something that you heard many times already. Later on, again, there were found errors in this preprint. I think they had some issues with the statistics that they used. So their findings were not correct. However, this was the most popular preprint in the first half a year of the pandemic, when people were still like, when we were still not sure even how deadly it is or what's going on. And despite this being not peer-reviewed, and despite this being eventually proven wrong, these findings spread rather wide and went into the wild on Twitter, as you can see here. So based on this, like our RQ3, we can already have a hunch about the RQ3 based on this. Again, we wanted to check if there is evidence of political partisanship in the sharing preprints of COVID-19 related preprints. And as you can again see, among the most shared preprints, these are all ones that were pretty much in line with what conservatives, so like led by, let's say, Donald Trump or Fox News commentators in the US, advocated on Twitter. So given that all of this is the most shared preference, there's, I think, only one that was like neutral and not going in line with indoor transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Yeah, the second one was not fully going with the arguments of conservatives about COVID being not as deadly and anyway treatable by hydroxychloroquine. So based on that, we can suppose that probably most people who shared this stuff were conservatives, but we don't know that and we need to somehow check it. And here we focused on the US context as tweets were collected overwhelmingly in English and coming from the US as we looked at them. So in the context of partisanship, we focused on the two US-based distinct groups, Republicans and Democrats. And to answer our question about the evidence of political partisanship in sharing patterns, we had to figure out the approximate proportion of Democrats and Republicans, here I refer to them as Dems and Reps for the sake of brevity, among the users who shared preprints, so the users in our data set. Any ideas on how to go about it, what one could do about it? Oh, and I see now a question also that I didn't notice before. I could imagine that there was an increasing number of preprints on medRxiv. Yeah. Does there are does more preprints that could be shared on Twitter? Did you check this? And if there was an increase, did you take this into account in your analysis? Yeah, so there could indeed be an increase in, as in there was in fact an increase in the number of preprints shared on medRxiv in general, like also with regard to COVID. We did not take this into account statistically, though we discussed it, but we normalized the findings in some other way to, I will go to it a little bit later, to show that there was actually a difference and that it was general public. So before that, as I said, it was mostly scientists and medics who shared preprints and mostly like, you know, among their own community, but that's but that's a very good question. And to make sure that something actually changed, we needed to answer exactly RQ3. And there was some modification made to RQ3. I will go back to it in a second. This second question is, so yeah, thank you for the question. And thank you for the suggestion. Maybe one can check if each user retweets more Republican than Democrat leaders. That could be the case. However, like that's a very valid suggestion. That's not what we did, but one could do that. One could also include not just Republican and Democrat leaders, but maybe also certain media, right? One problem was that maybe like with the leaders, the problem would be that maybe not everyone retweets politicians at all. So it might be that, you know, I'm an avid, okay, probably Republicans often retweeted Trump, but it might be that one is a Democrat and they do not retweet Joe Biden ever. And at that point in time, Joe Biden wasn't even elected yet, and there were just primaries going on, et cetera, et cetera. Well, but looking at retweeting behavior is a valid idea. And there are some studies that rely exactly on that to infer partisanship. They normally utilize, again, not just politicians' accounts, but also media. So, for example, one knows that Fox News is traditionally conservative and New Yorker is traditionally left in the US. So people who retweet way more of New Yorker, let's say, or are following more of progressive media than conservative media are probably conservative. So one could look indeed at retweeting or following behavior. Another option that, like besides that, we could just look at what people write, and we could go for text analysis. Even though we could use, again, yes, as you rightfully noted, like retweeting behavior, we also tried at first using some following behavior network analysis. We divided people into different groups, but that still did not very much advance us forward. So we had to turn to text analysis at some point, and I don't know how much experience all of you had with text analysis. So here are some basics and links to some very nice tutorials that I find very nice in R, again, because my main language is R. So text analysis can be instrumental or applied. Instrumental is when we conduct text analysis to infer certain characteristics and construct variables, and that's exactly what we did here. So we did not conduct text analysis for the sake of text analysis. That's applied one. That's, for example, when you want to know what are people discussing. So you don't want to infer from text, let's say, who these people are, and then maybe even put it into some regression or use it somehow else. So instead of having a concrete question that you just concrete characteristic that you're curious about and want to infer from text, you might be just exploring text and trying to figure out what people are discussing. So that's the difference. Another point that we should keep in mind is that text data is always dirty and requires some cleaning. Depending on, like, you should probably always remove stop words, but also depending on the language that you're using, you should stem the words, so bring them back to their kind of stem to their original form. We don't focus much on it here, but it's extremely important if you had experience with text analysis, and we should always keep in mind that garbage in, garbage out, essentially. And finally, another point that I want to make here is, here we focused again mostly on English because we checked and we found that we had very few non-English tweets in the data set. So we didn't lose much of the context by focusing on English, which probably makes sense that we didn't have much else. All of this, preprints were in English anyway. But sometimes one has to do or wants to do text analysis in multiple languages or in languages other than, let's say, English. And depending on the language of interest, different amounts of resources, like of libraries, of packages, of dictionaries, of models for computational text analysis exist. There are a lot, of course, for English. That's the main language for which everything is developed. Quite some for German. And barely anything you would find for Ukrainian or, let's say, Cantonese. I'm not like, I know that many people here come from Turkey. I have no experience with Turkish language text analysis, so I have no idea about the amount of resources that exist for it, but certainly less than for English. So that's certainly more complex in that, from that point of view. And yeah, comparing multiple languages can be super complex. And what we took here is the most basic kind of approach, the bag of words approach, as Ken Benoit, who developed quite some tools for text analysis, noted in his IC2S2 keynote speech in 2019, when it was still offline in Amsterdam. He said, we destroy language, to turn it into data. And that's exactly what we do with the bag of words. So we can have a text, but for many of commonly used forms of text analysis, like frequency-based text analysis, we destroy here the paragraph and we bring the words to their original form, and we put them into this, like, bag of words. So it's not a text anymore. It's not coherent text. We disregard all the syntactic and relationships between the words and the text. We just analyze the frequencies of words. That's again what that's the basis of a lot of text analytic techniques, and that's what we also relied on here. There are some more advanced techniques that also take into account, for example, the syntactic relationships between words, but they are so far, I would say, more used by computational linguists than by social scientists. But they're coming, and they're being developed, and probably they are the future. So maybe in 10 years from now, we won't be destroying the text anymore, as we will have more advanced, readily available techniques that also take into account all the syntactic relationships. Who knows? So what we tried to do when we wanted to infer, again, if our users are more conservative or more progressive, we try to check what do they tweet about to see if we can then cluster them somehow based on the topics they address. And we tried something called topic modeling. Again, I'm not sure if you have experience with that or not. Essentially, topic modeling allows you, based on the frequency of co-occurrences of words in a given corpus of text, to infer topics, let's say, so clusters of frequently co-occurring words, based on which you then can see if like that all these words probably refer to a certain topic, and then you can use the resulting topics to classify text, and you can see that, okay, this text refers to this topic, and this text like has 50% of this topic and 20% of that topic, etc., etc. Can be really helpful. There are also structural topic models which allow you to analyze the statistical prevalence, let's say, of different topics and so on and so forth. For example, on the left here, you can see the results of structural topic modeling applied to Twitter data to detect topics addressed in the aftermath of the 2016 terror attacks in Berlin on Twitter. Here the authors compared what was discussed in days 1 and 2, and then in days 3 through 7. And you can see that, for example, at first there was little political accusation, and then it jumped up. And there was, again, at first little calls for political change, then it jumped up. And instead, the sense of togetherness and calls for tolerance decreased like that. However, after we applied like topic modeling to our data, it didn't tell us much. Like, we didn't find a lot of political topics. We didn't find anything to cling on to try to classify our users. So we moved on from this. I just wanted, again, to take this detour to show, well, okay, mention topic modeling in case some of you have no experience with that, but also show that sometimes we make decisions during the research process, and the stuff we try does not lead us anywhere, and that's okay. It's okay to, like, you know, even though there are these some costs, it's fine to abandon the analysis that didn't lead you where you hoped it would lead you to, and not include it in the final product. So even though there might have been a lot of work invested into it, so that happened with, I mentioned that first we tried network analysis techniques, and then we tried topic modeling, and all of this didn't lead us anywhere, and it's not included in the final manuscript. And yeah, that's okay. That's just part of the process. So what did we do in the end? We also tried some other stuff, but I'm not gonna, talk about all the ways we tried and failed, because that would take probably too much time. Anyway, so what we could try, what we hoped would be possible, is try to predict users' political inclination based on their tweets, but for that we would need some ground truth data. So we would need some training data, for example, to put a machine learning model to work. We didn't have and we couldn't obtain, so we chose a very naive approach. People often write something about themselves in their Twitter bios, like, you know, this short description of yourself. So we used that, and we decided to simply match terms people used in their bios with terms that could be used by Republicans and Democrats, as well as by medics and scientists, what we refer to like medical professionals and scientists. Because in the exploration process, we thought it would be interesting to check whether the patterns of preprint sharing among the general public versus medical and academic professionals changed with the onset of the pandemic. So that has to partially deal with the Esther's question that she posed in the chat, because there wasn't in the overall number of preprints, and it could be that all this surge is driven by medical and academic professionals who just or whatnot. Wanted to identify those just in people's bias with a very short, actually, lists of terms. So for Democrat corresponding terms, we use DNC, Democratic, Republican corresponding terms, GOP, Trump, Republican, Conservative, and MAGA, Make America Great Again, scientist corresponding terms, university professor, science teacher, and for medical professionals, doctor, MD, medicine, medic, medical. Then all we have to do is count the users who employ terms of each group and their bios among the users in our. That is rather simple. And we saw that the big sharing preprints were published. However, this was not an sort of partisanship because there was something else we needed to do. In fact, though we saw that a lot of more users like sharing preference have Republican terms in their bios, others more like Republic, what we call like your Republicans than medics or scientists, prove anything yet. There could be many reasons for it. For example, it could be that there are more Republicans who Twitter in general. Than Democrats. It could be that found this group to be the biggest just because we were best at kind of detecting them because of the method used, or because again Republicans just use Twitter more. So to account for, we needed some baseline to compare our observation. So how the discussion of this specific topic of medical property to the general on Twitter, English-speaking Twitter. To do so, we collected bios of 10,000 random US users who tweeted in the same observation period. So effectively, we collected 10,000 random tweets from the same observation period for that year that we looked at. Then we collected those of you who posted this random 10,000 tweets. And we again checked the proportion of Democrats, Republicans, medics, and scientists based on our classification. And then we used in the end, as you can see, so like there was some complex listing here that needed like a whole appendix on how we normalize the data. Essentially, there is math behind it. What you can see here is though, after the normalization, even though, as I said, Republicans, the biggest group in our data set, if we normalize it to how many users of a certain group are there at random on Twitter, we can see that there are like, that preference was still discussed way more by those who identify as science and medical professionals, medical doctors on Twitter than by any of the two political groups. And this normalized interest, so how much they were interested in or how much they were sharing preference compared to how much different groups discuss other topics, we can see that after the start of the pandemic, Republicans suddenly surged above zero. So they discussed preference more than they would typically discuss any other topic. And Democrats never reached that threshold. In the end, we can see that most discussions were still held by scientists and medical professionals, just as before the pandemic. But then we also saw Republicans coming in. So it was not just scientists and medical doctors anymore. It was this proactive political group, which probably explains why we see so many tweets about hydroxychloroquine, for example, in our results. And the last question we had. So we saw that with the advent of COVID, more politically engaged users started tweeting preprints. Did this change how people refer to preprints? First, we saw if Democrats and Republicans and medics and scientists talk about preprints differently, and we relied on the bag of words approach, and we looked at the so-called word shift graphs. And here you can see that Democrats and Republicans use term study more often, and medical professionals and scientists refer more as preprint or paper. So preprint kind of emphasizes the fact that the paper is not peer reviewed yet, while study or studies are used interchangeably with preprint. So that's what changed with the advent of again, the order of my animations. And also you can see that before the pandemic, among all the tweets we had, most referred to them as preprints. But with the pandemic, and we argue that that's largely due to this politically engaged users coming in, the proportion of people referring to on Twitter to them as study or as research, in fact, increased, and the proportion of preprint decreased. So some final remarks and implications. So what we found, just to sum up, with the pandemic, more members of the general public started tweeting about medical preprints, and politically in the US, tweeting was dominated by Republicans. The discourse around preprints also shifted, so more people refer to them now as studies rather than preprints. So this emphasis on this paper not being peer-reviewed yet was gone. And now some implications of that. So we suggest that additional scrutiny is necessary from scientists, opinion leaders, social media platforms with respect to the non-peer-reviewed medical findings. Because in certain areas, sharing of preprints is not as grave. So for example, if we share some study about what did people talk about on Twitter during some period of time, and then its results are disconfirmed, like the results of this preprint, and it's never it's changed during the peer review, but some people already saw it and they shared it. The implications of that might be not as grave as the results of a medical preprint that is confirmed, because that might have to do with the public health and people's health. That's why we suggest this needs additional scrutiny. And we also observed the politicization of medical. Before COVID-19, this was the case with the vaccination. So vaccination-related debates were already politicized before the advent of COVID, and now they are, of course, even more politicized with regard to COVID. However, before COVID, not many other aspects were politicized online. So there are studies that, for example, looked at social media discourses around cancer or around different mental diseases, and none of those were politicized. So people were seeking information, were exchanging information, were exchanging their experiences, but there was no political debate around it, unlike with vaccines. However, with COVID, also new medical aspects became political, like medical measures, preventative measures. All COVID-related debates are suddenly political. So COVID in this sense is closer in terms of the politicization to the vaccination debate than to the debate around different other medical information and diseases. And that's it. That's for questions. I will now open the chat again because I closed it at some point, and I need to find it again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. There are indeed a couple of questions, and people already start to reply to each other. But maybe you...
Yeah. I will go through.
Thank you.
Just a second. I'm going back. Yeah, now I went back to the first question. So you mentioned that mostly scientists and physicians shared preprints. Is it legal to share a username name of people who share most number of preprints as an example to prove such claim, or is it considered as privacy violation? I would say that it depends on who that person is. So, for example, not the most shared, but the most retweeted tweet with one of those like top 10 came from Tucker Carlson, that Fox News personality. And even though we didn't focus on that, we didn't pursue like that part of the analysis further on who were these people driving, sharing of certain, like, let's say, hydroxychloroquine stuff, it would have been legal to share that because Tucker Carlson is public, like legal and ethical also. Tucker Carlson is a public personality. He's a public figure. He has, like, in the same way it would be perfectly ethical if we found that some other, I don't know, TV presenter or actor, politician, any like personality. When it comes to private people, well, with scientists, it's tricky. Sometimes they have, like, a very public account. Maybe they have a lot of following, then are essentially somewhat public figures. But if you would see that it's just some, like, random person who by chance got retweeted a lot, I would not share their name because they are not, like, a public figure. So when people make these decisions, they sometimes share usernames. I think what I have seen is now you can share the username if it doesn't contain a name, unless it's a public figure. So you would have to go through some of the usernames if you share them in a table, for example, in a research paper, to see that there are no usernames that are, like, let's say, first name, last name of a person, unless they are somebody very public. I hope that answers the question. I will go further. Which approach can be better for polarization research, dictionary, or other methods? That really depends on what you are studying, I think. I think somebody below answered, and there were some other questions. I'd like to return to that. What about including algorithmically deduced political affiliation of people I mentioned in my previous question in the article? Is this legal? I would not do that because political affiliation is private attribute and sensitive information. So I would not, like, list their political affiliation. So of course, probably, Tucker Carlson, you can say that he's a conservative commentator. He's very open about that. Or, like, if it's a politician, then of course you can share their party affiliation. But if you deduced something algorithmically, first of all, you might not be, like, fully sure that it reflects reality, because even the best machine learning model has the margin of error. And second of all, while it might be okay to use this information on aggregate, so you want to check again, what is the proportion of, let's say, Republicans and Democrats in your data, but deducing whether each individual user is a Democrat or Republican and publishing it, that's very sensitive information. So you might be wrong. And even if you're correct, that's sensitive. So these people didn't, want to share this. That's the same applies to other sensitive attributes. Let's say people's sexual orientation. They might not be okay with you sharing it. And it might even actually be, let's say, in certain, also, like, we talk now about the US, but in certain countries, let's say, sharing that somebody is gay might be actually dangerous for them. Same actually applies to political affiliation. So, as I originally come from Russia, like, I would never, if I deduced, let's say, that somebody is anti-government, I would never share their political affiliation in an article, because that might not be good. Would the tweet score package be helpful to estimate users' ideological position here? I'm not aware of the package. I'm aware of Pablo Barbera, so I think I know what you're hinting at. We looked at this stuff at Pablo's research, and there was a reason why we couldn't use it in that case. But to be very honest, I don't remember what that was. I think we lacked some data, or, like, there was something going on there. But in general, it can be useful, and Pablo does amazing research. I just really don't remember. I remember discussing it, my co-authors, but I don't remember why we didn't use it in the end. What about the overlap between researchers and Republican Democrats? That's a great question. There was very little overlap, to be honest, like there were just a handful of users and we removed them. We also removed the users who, like, according to this classification, were both Democrat and Republican, but we did not remove users who were both researchers and, scientists and medical professionals. So other overlaps were removed because it was very ambiguous. Yeah, tweet score works based on the US parameters, yes, but again, there was some reason and I don't remember what that was. Is there any chance to include social bots for these researchers? For instance, are there ways to manipulate the public opinion by using bot accounts on Twitter? Should we always take this issue? Yeah, definitely there is a chance to manipulate public opinion. And we actually also looked into this in this data set. We checked that it's like at least not dominated by bots. So there were a couple of methods we used for that. I would say that if you're dealing with political topics, it would be good to check, to take this into account and to conduct at least some basic checks. So for example, check the distribution of the numbers of followers of your accounts that you include or followees and how frequently they post, etc., etc. Botometer, I'm not sure if it's the same botometer as the one I think about, but there was and is a package called Botometer that's frequently used that I would not advise using for academic research. So there was that package, I mean, again, still is, but last there were a couple of studies published that convincingly showed that it doesn't work good enough for academic research. So it works good enough if you want to do it like for something quick and dirty, maybe some journalistic stuff, but it fails to convincingly identify bots on Twitter, even though it's very easy to use in English even, and in German, it just goes completely nuts. The paper I'm talking about is Kaiser and Rauchfleisch, Adrian Rauchfleisch and Jonas Kaiser, published in PLOS. This were convincing analysis on why we should never use Botometer again for research, or not the current version. What were the approaches for using network analysis tools and why didn't they work out? So what we tried was something very basic. We tried constructing retweet networks of our users, and we tried to then apply community detection algorithms to that to see if they are kind of, you know, in different, like if we can classify them in communities based on their tweeting behavior and retweeting behavior, and we indeed saw there's different communities. However, they were not as clear-cut as we would hope they would be. And at the center of all this, we saw not a political community, but no, not kind of, we saw very important as in popular accounts of, for example, scientists and medics. So there was who were retweeted by both sides. So there was much less clear-cut distinction than we would hope we would see. And we thought that it's not enough to then base resulting communities to assign users to one or the other. Because in that case, we also had no baseline. It would have been like very difficult to normalize it based on the baselines and so on and so forth. And tweeting behavior might have changed during the pandemic. So there was also the temporal aspect. So we, yeah, in the end, we did not use that. We didn't think that it's like reliable enough because we also, yeah, couldn't normalize the data. Dangers of digital trace data user analysis. Well, we can have access, yes, to private and sensitive information. So of course, when you are analyzing social media data, let's say, or other types of digital trace data, you should always keep in mind that this data was not made for research, right? That's just something that was left behind by people, and that people who gave as in posted something, did not give explicit access to you for using that for research. So you should be very careful with that data and not try to infer individual characteristics, try to de-identify people. So it might be, of course, possible to de-identify people, but it's not ethical. When you're using private or sensitive information, let's say based on people's tweeting behavior, you inferred their political views or some other sensitive attributes, you should only use the anonymized data. So I would, not even, maybe if it's something extremely sensitive, I would not even use the user account names. I would maybe even first pseudonymize them in a sense. So create a table where each user account is corresponding to one randomly generated number, and only you or your co-authors would have access to that table. And everything else you would then do with the manipulated pseudonymized table where you don't have the original names, but you have the this sequence of numbers. And then work with that. So dangerous, I mean, yeah, that's just something you have to keep in mind. I would not release very sensitive data or data that can be potentially used to de-identify users. Or that's something that we mentioned in the very beginning, that Twitter now requires that you only release tweet IDs if you share Twitter data for research, not full tweets. That also might be because otherwise it's possible, for example, that I post something on Twitter and then I delete my tweet, even though it's deleted for me and for Twitter, maybe somebody collected it for research and now it's out there forever and they have no control over it, right? Or maybe there will be released some information that will allow one to identify me, so on and so forth. So yeah, it can be sensitive and it might be a bit dangerous in a sense. I would just keep that in mind and maybe check, the established kind of check how other people do it. So check other papers and see what they write, the ethics. And there are a couple of papers focused specifically on the ethics of using social media data. Yeah. I think I don't know, are we?
Yeah, I think we're gonna stop the recording here.